In February of 2021, the Russian forces were viewed as one of the most powerful armed forces on planet Earth, second to only the United States of America. Its economy was one of the most influential in the world, controlling the largest oil sector on planet Earth, second only to the Saudis. However, just 2.5 years later, the Russian state is now in disarray, going from one of the world's most powerful nations to one that looks like it's on the verge of collapse. How did they get here? Why did they get here? And where is it going is a question many people are asking. Today on World Made Simple, we're going to take a look at the Russian Federation, the state of it, and what its future might be, uncertain as it is. Hey guys, Bill here, and today we're going to go ahead and jump into the Russian Federation and talk about a couple of different things, primarily the military, the economy, and the overall political situation within Russia. A lot of people have been talking about some of the different issues within the Russian Federation, but very few have actually been looking at the major issues. Primarily, the biggest one being Russia's kind of outdated in just about every single way. So we're going to go ahead and start with the biggest thing that Russia talks about today, the military. Like I mentioned before at the start of the video, the Russian military prior to the war in Ukraine was viewed as the top-notch military competitor of the United States. They were viewed as being able to hold their own against NATO in several regards and maintain the largest armor and artillery fleet in the world. Their air force was regarded as a pretty substantial fighting force, along with having multiple modern airframes and systems. Its navy, while lacking behind the United States in size, was still quite capable at the start of the war. Today, things are a little bit different. During the war in Ukraine, Russia is estimated to have gone down to 56% of their original stockpiles in terms of their armored fighting vehicles. This includes things like tanks, infantry support vehicles, mobile artillery platforms, rocket artillery platforms, just about everything. Additionally, the Russian Air Force has struggled to contain air superiority over the Ukrainian airspace, something that on paper they should be able to do quite easily. Lastly, the Russian Navy's been floundering against a nation that doesn't even have a naval fighting force. Ukraine's been extremely successful at forcing the Russian Navy back, and now their fleet has to move from Crimea, their headquarters, to Novorossiysk on the other side of the Black Sea. All of this comes about for a variety of reasons, primarily because the Russian military was not as powerful as we thought it was. The biggest example of this is shown in its training. Russian forces are primarily conscript-based, meaning that they have minimal training and are not there by their own choice. There is a volunteer portion of the Russian armed forces. However, it is no longer the significant force of the Russian army. The majority of the Russian army is now conscripts. Due to this, their skill, training, and overall ability is much lower than a standard infantry unit within the United States military or a common NATO infantry unit. The one thing that the Russians have managed to keep a hold of is their armor. However, this is mainly due to the fact that they have so many. And we are seeing the use of equipment that is used during the Cold War as far back as the T-55 tank model, developed all the way back in the 1950s. Russia still has a fair amount of modern vehicles and modern fighting tech, but on the field, they're not deploying it for whatever reason that might be, whether they're waiting for NATO to try and do something, or they don't want to risk losing this equipment in the field. Whatever the case, all experts around the world pretty much agree unanimously that the Russian armed forces have drastically underperformed. The expected fall of Ukraine within 2 weeks is now taking 2.5 years. Citing a variety of issues, the Russian Federation says their army is still in quite good fighting shape, but the situation on the ground says otherwise in a variety of levels. Regardless, Russia is losing far more men and equipment than expected in this war, and it will likely go ahead and not be able to be replaced anytime soon based on Russia's current production. And that leads us to the next problem for Russia, their economy. Prior to the war in Ukraine, the Russian Federation was one of the world's economic hubs and superpowers, primarily centered around the export of agricultural products, primarily wheat, and the export of oil-based products. So they became a center of both oil and food trade across the entirety of Eastern Europe. Before the war, they were one of the largest exporters of fuel, both in terms of natural gas and direct oil, to the European Union, And after they have started cutting off that supply, the Russian Federation economy has started to plummet. The Russian ruble, once somewhat comparable to the European standards being the euro and the pound, is now dropping significantly and is not looking like it's going to recover anytime soon. Additionally, a lot of the companies that were once present across Russia are now gone. Western companies like Shell, ExxonMobil, and BP have withdrawn their support for Russian oil. And this also means any of the Russian oil plants that relied on those companies for operation are now left in the dust and are not able to do anything to operate, putting Russia in a difficult place. Further making things difficult, the Russians' arms industry, currently being supported by the war, is not able to output anywhere near as much as they need to produce the war capacity for Russia. This includes things like microchips, explosives, and of course, full armored fighting vehicles and aircraft. They have tried going to China for a lot of these issues and a lot of these concerns, trying to export the oil to China and trying to go ahead and get resources from China. However, due to the lack of infrastructure across Siberia and overall most of Eastern Russia, this process has been very slow and tedious at best. Because of this, the Russian economy is expected to continue to decline as long as the war continues. And this is something that could potentially be a death blow for the Russian nation. And it's primarily because of how the politics of the nation work. Russia is a unique nation in terms of politics. Most people know that Putin is the main man in charge as the president of the Russian Federation. However, he might be the man in charge, but there's a bunch of extra stuff that goes on behind the scenes. The Russian Federation also has a secondary representative body known as the Duma. The Russian Duma is the equivalent of the US Congress. While the Duma is pretty much just for show at this point and most decisions go through Putin, they still have some power here and there. Additionally, because Russia is a federation, it is made up of multiple different countries all residing within the same nation. A lot of these countries are made up of minorities who kind of serve at the whim of Moscow. And many of these countries have been very unhappy with the conditions of the Ukraine war and that many of their people are being pulled to go fight a war meant for Moscow, not for them. This has led to several protests, demonstrations across the entirety of the Russian Federation, primarily near the Middle East, the Caucasus regions, as well as in Siberia. In fact, there was an election that took place in Siberia to determine whether or not they would secede from Russia. Russia obviously squashed this very quickly, declared it illegitimate, and held the ones who held the election responsible, and as far as I'm aware, they are now in jail. So the political situation in Russia is shaky, and the economy is not making that any better. Residents in St. Petersburg and Moscow, originally untouched by the war, are now starting to feel its full weight. And a lot of people in Russia are starting to express their dissatisfaction with the Putin regime. I don't think this is going to lead to a full-scale revolt across Russia, but I do think this is going to be something that Putin needs to keep an eye on. However, this is just the start of the issues. Russia has one other huge problem barreling down the tracks, and that isn't from politics, from its economics, or even from its military. It's from its age. Since the end of the Cold War, the Russian state has kind of leaned on the idea of the Soviet Union to stay relevant, whether it be going and looking at their old military equipment from the Soviet era, or using the Soviet system as itself to lead people to think of getting a better life by going back to the Soviet times. I don't mean turning communist, I mean as propaganda. However, there's also one other thing aging, and that's its people. The Russian people are primarily getting older and older, and many of them have not had children. This has led to a population collapse within Russia, and this has been highlighted by the Ukraine war. Many of the soldiers going to the front lines are not young men, but are elderly and are unable to serve in many other national militaries. But because of the population crisis, Russia has no other choice but to send these individuals to the front line and fight. This has been a sour taste in the mouths of many Russian citizens, and over the last 2.5 years, we've seen public approval for this practice drop further and further, but it only increased in scale. With an aging population, an aging military, and an aging mindset overall, the Russian Federation is on a collision course with collapse unless it modernizes relatively soon in its entire mindset. I don't think the Russian Federation is going to collapse or implode. I think that it's going to go ahead and have a slow and painful death over the next couple of years. But the question is, will they go quietly into that good night? Or will they try and take some of the rest of the world down with them? It's part of the reason NATO is involved in Ukraine in the first place. That's a topic for another video. I've been Bill, this is World Made Simple, and I will see you guys in the next video. Take it easy.